While I was away on a business trip, she took it upon herself to repaint my entire house in neon orange. And no, it wasn't just a splash of color or a harmless prank. I'm talking full-scale saturation at every square inch. Siding, shutters, garage door, mailbox, even the birdhouse. When I pulled into my driveway that Sunday night, the place looked like it had been dipped in radioactive cheese. I hadn't even popped the trunk to get my suitcase before the neighbors started to flock over. Each wore that awkwardly polite expression usually reserved for someone confessing they've joined a doomsday cult. One woman leaned in and whispered, "Is this like part of a new lifestyle?" As though I had suddenly lost my grip on reality. And who was standing triumphantly across the street, cocktail in one hand and HOA clipboard in the other? None other than Karen Delina, president of the Homeowners Association, full-time neighborhood irritant, and self-appointed style police of Oak Ridge Estates. Let me back up a bit. I moved into Oak Ridge Estates about 2 years ago. New job, decent salary, and the kind of neighborhood that boasted mature trees and strong community values. What the brochure failed to mention was that said values were dictated almost entirely by Karen and her squad of suburban enforcers. From week 1, I was put on notice. Apparently, my mulch was the wrong shade, my solar lights blinked too much, and, my personal favorite, my mailbox clashed with a colonial theme. I complied barely because I had more pressing things to focus on. But I didn't bend the knee. And Karen? Karen doesn't like it when people skip her coronation. Things really escalated 6 weeks ago. I'd hired a contractor to repaint my house in a simple, neutral gray. HOA approved. All the necessary permits in place. Nothing controversial. But Karen? She claimed the color was depressing and cited some vague violation of Section 3B in the HOA guidelines. Unsurprisingly, she had helped revise those same rules last year after someone painted their shutters navy blue and triggered one of her legendary 6-week headaches. I appealed. She rejected it. I escalated again. The HOA board, which consisted of her sister, her Pilates instructor, and some guy eternally grateful she brings pastries to meetings, and upheld a denial. Still, it was just paint. I figured I'd get through the process, and worst case scenario, I'd repaint if the city took her side. But while I was out of town closing a deal in Phoenix, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She brought in her cousin, a barely legal moralista, to coat my home in the most retina-searing shade of orange I've ever seen. It wasn't just unattractive. It was hostile. You needed sunglasses just to walk past it at night. She even left a smug little sticky note on my front door. "Fixed it for you. You're welcome. HOA Code 3 safety first." As though she'd installed a fire extinguisher instead of defacing my property. The police came. A city inspector came. Even the local news showed up. But all anyone could say was, "It's a civil issue," like she had knocked over a flower pot instead of weaponizing an entire house. Because both homes were privately owned, and it was considered an internal HOA conflict, my only options were small claims court or mediation. Meanwhile, I was living inside a house that looked like a traffic cone with a mortgage. Karen, naturally, smiled through every media interview. She told the press I was erratic, hostile to community values, and disruptive to neighborhood harmony. After turning my house into a radioactive box of crayons. That night, I sat in my garage with a bourbon, a folding chair, and a pounding rage headache, and I decided, no more defense. If Karen wanted a war in the name of neighborhood aesthetics, then fine, I'd fight back, not with graffiti or retaliation, with something far more effective: quiet, invisible legal destruction. Her garage was her temple. 2 spotless cars, a bar fridge, a crafting space for her Etsy knockoff empire selling live, laugh, love signs, and, most importantly, the sacred HOA archive. Every citation, regulation, map, and newsletter all meticulously filed in color-coded bins beside a dedicated printer she had affectionately named HOA. Her husband, Bob, wasn't even allowed inside. She locked the space with a fingerprint scanner, and I watched her test it each morning like she was preparing nuclear launch codes. Her garage was her castle, which made it the perfect weak point. Now, I want to make this very clear: I didn't break any laws. My job in property logistics and asset relocation has equipped me with a particular set of skills. It's a fancy way of saying I help coordinate construction, demolition, and land use changes for development projects. And in the process, I've learned a thing or two about paperwork specifically, how it can quietly reshape reality. So I started digging. I located the original land deed for her property and found out something very interesting. Her beloved garage extended 14 inches into the community easement that bordered our lots. 14 inches. Sounds minor, right? But in zoning law, that's a chasm. That's enough for a legal dispute, especially when framed as a safety or accessibility concern. So I filed a complaint. Emergency easement review. Safety risk. I attached pages of documentation and dozens of photos showing the encroachment, even gathered statements from a couple of neighbors she'd ticked off during her self-appointed sprinkler inspections. The city's development office responded quickly. The city took one look at my report and escalated it faster than I imagined. Not only did they issue a citation, but they followed it up with a full demolition order. Turns out, for all Karen's obsessive rule following, she'd never properly refiled for a variance when she rebuilt her garage 5 years back. That missing piece of paperwork was the crack in her foundation. She lost. Ida yelled, appealed, even tried to sway the inspector with a plate of homemade HOA cookies. I wish I were joking. None of it made a dent. The order held firm. So, being the thoughtful neighbor I am, I offered my assistance in relocating her precious garage off the easement. With a fully licensed contractor crew I'd lined up ahead of time, Karen's sacred space was gently removed from its foundation at 3 a.m. on a misty Thursday morning and rolled to a rented storage lot down the road, completely above board and legally permitted. By sunrise, all that remained in her driveway was a patch of dirt, 2 extremely confused cats, and an HOA president teetering on the edge of a public meltdown. Here's the kicker: every last HOA document she possessed, every fine, every edit to the bylaws, all of it was inside that garage when it was relocated. She never thought to back anything up. Her empire was now in bureaucratic limbo, boxed and bolted inside a storage unit awaiting a zoning board hearing scheduled months away. As for my own house, still blazing orange, I haven't decided what color to paint it yet. I'm leaning toward navy blue just to send her migraines into overdrive. Her move, when Karen woke to find her garage missing, the shriek she let out was so piercing. The neighborhood genuinely thought there had been a death. In a way, they're hot at her authority. For 4 years, she'd ruled Oak Ridge Estates like a Pilates-sculpted dictator in wedge heels. That garage was her throne room. Now, just a dirt slab and a bruised ego. I watched from across the street, sipping my coffee and watering my already damp bushes, as she spiraled into chaos. She called the cops, the city inspector, her cousin/welder, and even tried to get Channel 7 to cover the incident. The police shrugged. It was all legal. The inspector confirmed the documentation was solid. Her cousin took one look at the official order posted on the site and got back in his truck. Channel 7 declined a follow-up, telling her, "This has transitioned from a human interest piece to a zoning matter." But losing the garage wasn't the true blow. The real disaster was the loss of her HOA files. And without those, the control she wielded started to unravel. Most people in Oak Ridge weren't bad neighbors, they just didn't have the energy to go up against her. Karen thrived on fear, confusion, and the knowledge that the average person would rather avoid conflict than sift through piles of bureaucracy. But with her documentation gone, fines, citations, contractor forms, amendment records, her authority started to wobble like a three-legged stool. I didn't have to do a thing. The neighborhood turned on her all on its own. First came Jeff, dog dad to 3 large bark-happy pups. He'd been fined for excessive canine vocalization every single month. No paperwork, no payment. Then Lisa and Jamila, long victims of Karen's disdain for their patio furniture, rolled out a full-on tiki bar setup and dared her to object. When she tried, they simply asked for proof of non-compliance. She couldn't provide any. By the end of that week, flags were flying from porches, cars were being parked street-side just for the fun of it, and new, ultra-modern mailboxes were popping up everywhere, each one a not-so-subtle middle finger to Karen's reign. The HOA still technically existed, but with no records to enforce anything. It was like a security system with no passcode, useless. And Karen? She was like the cashier at a broken register, screaming for everyone to trust her math. Of course, She didn't go down quietly. Karen pivoted from dictator to concerned patriot overnight. She started giving dramatic monologues during jogger traffic in the mornings, shouting about a coordinated attack on community order. She handed out flyers featuring a poorly photoshopped photo of me on my front porch with a headline reading, "Is this your neighborhood menace?" Somiania still unknown printed 100 copies and replaced the word menace with king. One is still proudly displayed on my fridge. She tried to summon an emergency HOA board meeting. Only 2 people showed, her sister and the Pilates friend. Even Bob, her own husband, was a no-show. Last I heard, he was spending most of his time hiding in their backyard shed, pretending to repair the lawnmower. I actually started to feel a little bad for the guy. Living with Karen must have been like enduring a non-stop home meeting with jazz hands and no coffee. And then came the cherry on top. Karen officially filed a complaint with the city, accusing me of malicious intent, theft of personal property, and community destabilization. Yes, those were her exact words, as if she were reporting a Cold War defector. I received a formal notice from the city asking for a response, so I gave her one. I submitted a 300-page counter-complaint. It included receipts, security footage, drone images, sworn statements from neighbors, and a notarized timeline of every violation she had committed over the past 6 months. Karen didn't expect me to go scorched earth. She thought I'd lawyer up, maybe argue. She wasn't ready for the logistical shockwave I unleashed. Karen never expected the kind of precision I brought to the table. She had no idea my actual job involved managing contractors and navigating municipal red tape. She didn't know I once helped resolve a land dispute in Kansas where a highway accidentally ran through an old cemetery. In her mind, I was just the guy with a weird mailbox and a chip on his shoulder. What she failed to realize was that I was her worst nightmare, calm, methodical, and armed with a spreadsheet. The city didn't just side with me, they shut her down completely. Her complaint was tossed out, and to make matters worse, they opened a formal investigation into potential misuse of HOA funds. Turns out, when you don't keep receipts, skip permits for construction projects, and somehow misplace $12,000 in association dues, people start asking questions. That's when things stopped being neighborhood drama and turned into something real. Because once the word audit entered the conversation, Karen started to come apart like a knockoff sweater. She went into full denial mode, claimed she had backups, claimed she had paper trails, but everything had been stored in the garage inside a locked cabinet she once proudly referred to as her vault. When the city requested email records, she discovered her account had been wiped clean after she clicked on a bogus coupon for 50% off HOA-branded polos. Malware had eaten the rest, and those official HOA votes, yeah, half of them were just notes she'd scribbled and slid under people's doors, marked approved. Soon, residents started asking for their money back. Lisa even started wearing a custom t-shirt during her 7 a.m. walks that read, "Where's the money, Karen?" A small group of neighbors retained a lawyer to explore dissolving the HOA entirely. Me? I just waited, quietly, patiently, because I knew Karen wasn't done yet. Her last tactic was the sympathy card. She started showing up to community events limping dramatically, claiming stress-induced vertigo. She held garage sales where she sat tearfully next to ceramic frogs and old wreaths, telling anyone who'd listen that she'd been betrayed by the very neighborhood she tried to protect. Bob, her husband, stopped sleeping in the shed and started crashing at his brother's place. I couldn't blame him. She tried getting the media involved again, but not a single outlet took the bait. Even Channel 7 stopped returning her calls. That's when she crossed the line. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had just gotten back from brunch when I noticed my side gate was ajar and footprints in the flower bed. At first, I figured the landscaper might have come early. Then I saw her, Karen, crouched by my foundation wall, armed with a tape measure, a level, and what looked like half a measuring wheel. She was muttering and pacing, measuring the distance from my back porch to the fence like she was building a legal case against my house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't panic. I calmly pulled out my phone, took a photo, and called the police. When the officer arrived as someone who'd already been to 2 other Karen-related calls that week, he kept things civil. He asked her why she was there. She claimed it was an HOA survey. He asked to see a permit. She didn't have one. She said the property line was historically ambiguous. He told her to leave. She refused, and that's how Karen got herself handcuffed for the first time in her life. She was led out of my yard, dirt on her knees, a neon measuring tape trailing behind her, yelling about boundary rights while half the neighborhood watched from their lawns. Someone actually clapped. Bob didn't show up to pick her up from the station. Then a broken bar silence. For 3 days, Karen disappeared. No flyers, no porch speeches, no handwritten citations taped to mailboxes. For someone like Karen, that quiet was deafening. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to regroup. And right on cue, the comeback arrived. On the 4th morning, every mailbox in the neighborhood was stuffed with a glossy, full-color HOA newsletter, thicker than usual. Its title, printed in bold, dramatic font, A Return to Order, Emergency HOA Reinstatement Act. The front page featured a photo of Karen standing on the empty slab where her garage once stood, one hand raised like a general rallying troops. According to her so-called proclamation, the HOA was being restructured for transparency and protection, and a mandatory emergency meeting had been scheduled for all homeowners to ratify her new bylaws. She'd even declared herself acting president and interim treasurer, despite the board not having met or voted on a single change. The whole thing was wrapped in patriotic imagery, American flag watermark, italicized language about defending community values. Honestly, it read like a parody. I half expected it to end with "by royal decree of Queen Karen I." The emergency meeting was set for Saturday morning in the community recreation hall. There was no way I was missing it. Apparently, neither was anyone else. By the time I got there, the place was overflowing. More than 40 residents had shown up, families, retirees, even a few teens, likely just curious to see what brand of drama Karen would deliver this time. At the front stood Karen, positioned behind a podium she must have dragged in herself. She was flanked by folding tables stacked with binders, forms, and bottled water labeled with her initials. She launched into a speech that felt like a TED Talk, a broken bar if TED hated logic and loved power trips. Karen's speech was a mess of buzzwords and shaky logic, talking about unifying the aesthetic identity of Oak Ridge Estates, preserving property values, and my personal favorite, recovering from the trauma caused by hostile actors. That's how she referred to me, hostile actor. I half expected her to accuse me of being a covert agent from some anti-HOA resistance group. She tried to keep it professional, measured, but you could see her neck was blotchy with stress, her hands trembling just beneath the podium, her eyes darting between faces in the crowd. The polished mask was slipping, and everyone knew it. Then she passed out her proposed emergency amendments, and they were laughably authoritarian. She wanted all house colors to be personally pre-approved by her. She included $2,000 fines for any architectural violations and proposed restoring the missing HOA archives through community recollection, meaning, if someone remembered being fined, that fine still stood. The room went silent. People flipped through the pages, stunned. Then Jeff stood up. "So, let me get this straight. You think we'll just sign off on your dictatorship again because you printed it on glossy paper?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Karen stiffened. "Excuse me?" Jeff didn't hold back. "You trespassed on someone's property. You destroyed HOA records. You painted a man's house like a radioactive traffic cone. And now you want us to hand you the reins again?" Karen's voice went up a full octave. "Those were all misunderstandings. The real threat is letting this community descend into chaos." Lisa cut in smoothly. "We weren't in chaos, Karen. We were just under your control." That did it. The crack split wide open. Karen dropped the binder she was clutching, pointed a shaking finger straight at me, and shouted, "He's the reason all of this happened. He sabotaged everything. He's been poisoning this community with his smugness." The room froze. I raised a lazy hand, guilty on the smugness. "But I don't recall painting anyone's house." That broke the tension. Laughter swept across the room. Karen's expression twitched, trying to reel everything back in, but the momentum had already turned. People started getting up. A few took her pamphlets out of politeness, but nobody signed. Within minutes, she was left standing behind her folding tables, surrounded by water bottles with her initials, binders no one wanted, and dreams of a regime that had finally collapsed. The next morning, I filed the paperwork along with 32 other homeowners to initiate a vote to dissolve the HOA. According to the bylaws, we needed 60% of residents to sign. We reached that within 2 days. Turns out, the only thing Karen ever successfully unified was the neighborhood's mutual disdain for her leadership. Even Bob signed the petition with big, shaky letters that looked like they were written with pure relief. That should have been the end. But for Karen, losing control didn't feel like defeat. It felt like death. And she wasn't going to go quietly. On Wednesday afternoon, a moving truck showed up, and not to help her pack, but to deliver a fresh arsenal of propaganda. Identical boxes stacked in pyramid formation on her front lawn, each labeled Karen's HOA Rescue Initiative. I watched from my porch as she set them out like ceremonial offerings. Inside, pamphlets, tiny flags, lawn signs, and pre-filled complaint forms for nearly every house on the block. She even included custom citations, color-coded and numbered, accusing neighbors of absurd infractions like unauthorized tomato plants and overly cheerful mailbox designs. And then she crossed the line. She taped one of those fluorescent orange flyers to my front door. It read, "This property is currently under investigation," and scrawled underneath in red ink, "Pending remediation for structural encroachment, visual disruption, and behavioral instability." Behavioral instability. I didn't just trip it down, I documented it. I photographed it, scanned it, and added it to a growing digital archive I'd been quietly building for a week. Because while Karen thought she was playing chess, I was already 5 moves into the endgame. That night, I filed for a restraining order. The next morning, she was servida in broad daylight, on her front lawn, in full view of the entire cul-de-sac. The look on her face, a perfect cocktail of shock, betrayal, and righteous indignation, like Caesar realizing Brutus had better legal counsel. She tried to argue with the process server. She tried calling the police, but no one came. Karen hadn't just burned bridges, she turned them into bonfires, danced in the flames, and demanded applause. 1 week later, the vote passed. The HOA was officially dissolved. Karen held a candlelight vigil on her lawn for the spirit of our once great community. Bob didn't attend. Most people assumed it was some kind of satire. Someone placed a lawn gnome in the center of her shrine. It held a little sign that read, "Free at last." It stayed there for days. But even with the HOA officially dead and buried, I knew my job wasn't quite done. Because Karen still hadn't learned. She never admitted what she'd done. She had painted my house, erased her own records, harassed an entire neighborhood, and tried to brand me as unhinged. Now, for the first time, I had all the leverage I needed to make sure she'd never pull this again. The day after the HOA dissolved, I made a quiet move. I made a quiet phone call to the county records office. Hidden deep in the original development documents for Oak Ridge Estates was a small legal clause, something Karen had clearly missed, and it was about to turn everything upside down. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I simply smiled, went back inside, and waited, because the most satisfying part of playing the long game isn't winning, it's watching the other side slowly realize they already lost. Karen had no idea, but she was living on borrowed land. Literally, the clause I discovered wasn't just a forgotten legal curiosity, it was a loaded trap wrapped in decades-old paperwork. When Oak Ridge was developed 25 years ago, the builders inserted a clause tied to parcels of land used for community administration. According to that clause, if the HOA ever disbanded, any of that land, unless re-registered within 60 days, would automatically revert to its original trust. And as of 6 months ago, I owned that trust. I'd bought it on a hunch after noticing some peculiar entries in the county registry. Got it for less than what most people pay for a second-hand lawn tractor. At the time, it seemed like an interesting quirk. Now, it was a masterstroke. Turns out, a significant portion of Karen's front yard, including her garage, lab, and the lawn she used to stage her dramatic HOA comebacks, was built on that administrative parcel. Her arrogance had pushed the limits of her property line, but it was her ignorance that sealed her fate. The land she once lorded over now belonged to me, and I had the legal title to prove it. I wasn't interested in evicting her or going full cartoon villain with a wrecking ball. That wasn't the point. I just wanted her to finally feel what it was like to live under someone else's rule the same way she had forced the rest of us to live for years. So I did what Karen would have done in my shoes. I mailed her a formal notice. The letter stated my intent to enhance and repurpose the lot for aesthetic community benefit in accordance with post-HOA neighborhood standards. I even included a design mock-up, a tranquil rock garden, a composting corner, and a community message board right where her little shrine had stood. She thought it was a joke. Not long after, she came storming across the street, waving the letter like she'd just been eliminated from a very petty game show. I opened the door wearing gym shorts and a t-shirt that said "Good Vibes" on a deliberate choice. "I'll admit, this is ridiculous," she snapped, jabbing the paper at me. "You can't own my front lawn." "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. That section was part of the HOA's administrative lot. When the HOA dissolved, the land reverted to the trust. I own the trust now. You're free to confirm it with the county of HOA, or I can email you the paperwork. What's your address again? Is it still queen.karen@gmail? She blinked. You a broken bar, you can't just build on it. I'm not building, I said with a smile. I'm beautifying. Very Oak Ridge of me, don't you think? For the first time since she splashed that hideous neon paint on my house, Karen had no response. Her mouth opened at a broken bar but nothing came out. Then, in classic Karen fashion, she pivoted. She marched home, printed up more flyers, and plastered them around the neighborhood. This time, she labeled me a land pirate. Honestly, I didn't hate the title, but the neighborhood had stopped listening. Her credibility had crumbled. People who once tiptoed around her now openly rolled their eyes. Even Doreen, the elderly neighbor who defended her like a strict headmistress from some bygone convent, finally gave up when Karen accused her cat of being a zoning violation in feline form. The only creature that seemed to willingly spend time with Karen now was a raccoon squatting in the ruins of her garage. Still, I wasn't out to ruin her completely. I gave her 30 days to remove her personal effects and the shrine from the property before I made any changes. She spent most of that time sitting on a folding chair beside a stack of boxes, keeping vigil like a soldier guarding sacred treasure. Bob, meanwhile, stopped coming home. The neighbors stopped pretending to support her. Then, on the 29th day, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a single note. Do what you want. Just know you've destroyed something beautiful. I had to read it twice to believe she'd written that with a straight face. That weekend, a small landscaping crew arrived. We transformed the empty slab into a peaceful little public space, Zen-inspired and community-friendly. We added ornamental grasses, a couple of benches, and a wooden board made from reclaimed fencing where residents could pin actual community notices. By Sunday afternoon, the shrine was gone. In its place stood a single stone marker, engraved with 3 simple words: "No more citations." The neighborhood loved it. Families came by for photos, kids raced scooters along the new gravel paths, someone donated a tiny free library. The irony wasn't lost on any. The same woman who fined people over pastel flower pots now lived next to a garden she had no say in. And that's when Karen finally broke. Monday morning, she emerged from her house in a bathrobe and gardening gloves, clutching a full gallon of paint. Not just any paint, a highlighter yellow, practically a twin of the hideous orange she once smeared across my house. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a statement. She stomped across her former kingdom toward the new garden and began splashing the paint wildly across the bench, the sign, the gravel, all while yelling about corruption and conspiracies. Karen was yelling about sabotage, about reclaiming the neighborhood's former glory. I called the police again. By the time they arrived, Karen was knee-deep in neon chaos, yellow streaks smeared across her arms, her lawn, and what used to be the HOA shrine. The officers recognized her right away. One of them actually let out an audible sigh as he stepped out of the cruiser. Karen insisted it was a symbolic protest. The officer responded, "Ma'am, you're defacing property that isn't yours." She exploded, accusing me of theft, lies, and single-handedly undermining democracy. He didn't flinch. "The title's right here, Karen. It's filed, stamped, and valid. You can't just repaint someone else's land every time you have a meltdown." They gave her a final warning. I declined to press charges, not because I felt merciful, but because I had something better in mind, something that would stick. I filed a civil motion to impose a behavioral easement along the property line. Essentially, it legally prohibited Karen from stepping onto the portion of land that was once part of her yard. If she crossed into it again, she'd be in direct violation of a court order. The motion passed. I laminated the court's decision and mounted it on a post right at the edge of her lawn. The day I installed it, Karen stood behind her window, glaring. I could feel the intensity of her stare through the glass, but she didn't come outside. She just pulled the curtain shut and stayed out of sight for the rest of the day. With her sidelined, the neighborhood slowly returned to peace. Mailbox inspections stopped. The endless newsletter spam vanished. The daily grumbles about untamed hedges and mismatched flower pots faded away. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates felt like a place people actually wanted to live in, not just survive. Then, something strange happened. A week later, Bob showed up on my porch. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes darting, shirt rumpled, clutching a shoebox under one arm. "She's up to something," he muttered. "Something legal?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know," he said. "All I know is she's been digging through old HOA documents every night of files she stashed in the attic. Not the garage stuff. Contracts, amendments, receipts, a broken bar. She's not trying to revive the HOA. She's trying to re-engineer it." The target? The old clubhouse lot. It had always been a no-man's land, a quarter-acre patch of gravel and weeds behind the run-down community center, enclosed by rusted chain link and marked with a weather-beaten sign that said future recreational use. For over 2 decades, nobody had touched it, until Karen did. By the time I got there, a prefab trailer had already been placed on the lot, a portable beige office unit with a makeshift sign above the door that read, Oak Ridge Civic Authority. Not HOA, not Neighborhood Watch. Civic Authority. It couldn't have been more obvious if it had flashing lights. No posted permits, no work order, just a loud generator humming in the back and a motion sensor light duct taped to a pole. Out front, she had a folding table covered in clipboards, forms, and laminated documents announcing the resurrection of neighborhood guidelines. Karen wasn't just trying to bring the HOA back, she was trying to reinvent it from the ground up, under a new name and legal shell, and she'd found a loophole buried deep in the past, a decade-old deed variance left by the original developers. It was meant to grant temporary access for administrative use during early construction phases. Karen, of course, saw it as her golden ticket. She stood beside the trailer, wearing beige slacks, a navy blazer, and a plastic badge clipped to her lapel. Director Karen Delaney. Okay. Yes, she even made herself an acronym. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or start prepping my backyard for trench warfare. I approached slowly, carrying a broken bar. You looked at a forgotten patch of gravel and thought, you know what would really shine here? A bureaucratic dictatorship. She didn't even blink. This is a lawful civic authority, operating under Variance 18B.5 of the original development charter. I filed my intent with the county clerk, effective immediately. Oak Ridge is under transitional civic oversight. I looked down at the table. Arthusian broken bar tickets. She grinned. Citation software now. If compliance rates remain low, we'll escalate to formal enforcement. Enforcement? I echoed. Like what? Toll booths on sidewalks, driveway parking meters, she said with a tight smile. Don't push me. I'm not, I replied. But the county might, because the moment Bob handed me that dusty variance, I had my own legal filing in motion. I submitted a request for a conditional injunction to have the clause reviewed. My attorney, Sheila, a woman with a professional allergy to HOA, took one look at it and labeled it what it was: a procedural fossil. The clause Karen had staked her power grab on, it was outdated and misapplied. It granted. The clause Karen was relying on only applied during active construction or transitional development phases, both of which had ended more than 15 years ago. That meant Karen wasn't just pretending to have authority, she was effectively squatting on public land. The court hearing was set for the following week, but in her mind, Karen had already claimed victory. Within 3 days, she mailed out 84 official-looking compliance letters, each printed on glossy cardstock with gold borders. She cited neighbors for everything imaginable: unapproved roof designs, improperly stored holiday decorations, and one bizarre one, emotional resistance to governance. I still don't know what that even means. One poor guy got fined for psychological graffiti because his teenager's garage band played too loud with the windows open. People were furious but cautious. Karen had always used intimidation as her weapon of choice, and now with a makeshift title and a laminated badge, she was at her most dangerous. A few neighbors came to me looking for guidance. I told them the truth. Karen's authority was a bluff. The land wasn't hers. The clause wouldn't hold. She was counting on fear and confusion to keep people compliant until the court stepped in. All we had to do was wait. But Karen didn't. She doubled down. She brought in a private security team she dubbed the Neighborhood Integrity Patrol. They wore orange vests and carried laminated ID cards. Two of them began walking the neighborhood, photos of driveways, measuring yards with tape, and issuing stern warnings about non-compliant leisure zones. One of them even told Jeff his wind chimes violated auditory conformity standards. That night, I set up 3 motion-triggered trail cameras around my property. Not because I was scared but because I knew Karen's finale wouldn't be subtle, and I wanted evidence. I was right. 2 nights before the hearing, at 1:47 a.m., one of the cameras picked up movement. A figure crept into my yard, carrying a rectangular contraption. She crouched next to my mailbox, yes, that infamous mailbox, and began attaching something to the post. It looked like a DIY citation printer, wires, a label dispenser, maybe a battery pack. When I zoomed in, there she was, a Karen, in a bathrobe, zip-tying what she later claimed was a prototype compliance distribution unit to my mailbox. In the middle of the night, the next morning, I printed the footage, framed it, and brought it to court. Karen arrived dressed like she was preparing to speak at a city council awards dinner. Navy dress suit, hair sprayed into place like it was load-bearing, and a manila folder labeled "OCal Legal Defense." She opened with a grand claim that her authority wasn't derived from any current law, but from community necessity. Sheila, my lawyer who hated hoes with religious zeal, countered with 6 direct violations of local ordinances, 4 sworn witness statements, and that glorious photo of Karen in her bathrobe by my mailbox. The judge didn't need long. In under 15 minutes, he ruled that the original clause Karen cited had long since expired. The land she claimed was legally designated for recreational use only. Her trailer office, unauthorized occupancy. He ordered its immediate removal and issued a cease and desist against all of her so-called enforcement activities. Karen didn't say a word. She just sat there, mouth slightly ajar, clinging to her folder like it might keep her from drowning. As I walked past her, I offered her a tissue. By the weekend, the trailer was gone, the fake badge retired, the signs disappeared, the pseudo-security force dissolved. Karen vanished for a week. And when she finally re-emerged, something had changed. She seemed a broken bar smaller, like the energy that once powered her obsession had finally flickered out. Her hair was down, her face unreadable. She started taking long, quiet morning walks. No clipboard, no flyers, just stillness. And, strangely, it was kind of sad. Not because I felt sorry for Hero, but because I finally understood something. Karen didn't just crave control. She craved meaning. She needed to feel important, needed, necessary. And when that illusion collapsed, so did she. Eventually, Bob came home. They began gardening together, not surveillance gardening, but real gardening. Slowly, Karen faded into the background of the very community she once ruled. As for me, I finally repainted the house navy blue, the same color she once claimed triggered her migraines. No one said a word. In fact, a few weeks later, someone left a bottle of champagne on my porch. The card said, "For services rendered to the neighborhood, the public garden still blooms. The little free library gets fresh books every week. Kids ride scooters through the gravel paths and decorate the pavers with chalk drawings. No more warnings, no more measurements, no ho, just peace." As for Karina, sometimes, when I pass her yard and she's out trimming her bushes, she gives me the faintest nod. Not quite friendly, not quite bitter, just a quiet recognition, like, we both remember what we went through, and we both made it. That's enough. I won.